Hey class, welcome to Lecture 1 for California History, and today's lecture is going to correspond with Chapter 1 of your textbook. So this lecture actually contains quite a few video links embedded in it. So I do recommend, if you'd like to get a fuller picture and a little bit more richness in terms of visual images and things like that, that you click on the video links that you see located on the screen. That will open up a separate YouTube link that should take you to what it's described. So for example, here on the first slide, we have a link to the Cahuilla bird singers. So the Cahuilla bird singers are still around, and they perform on a regular basis the bird songs of the Cahuilla people, which are like songs that kind of recount their history and tell their history through generations through song. So there's a link to that here. But as I said, most of the information here is going to correspond to information in Chapter 1 of your text. So let's begin. So we're going to begin each lecture with lecture questions, which will essentially kind of get you warmed up thinking about what we're going to be answering, what questions we're going to be answering with this lecture. Kind of gives you a sense of what the topics of the lecture are as well. So we're going to answer a couple of questions, and they're simple questions, but there's a lot of complexity to the answers of these questions. The first question is, what makes California unique? So hopefully we will get an answer to that through this lecture. And then finally, who are the native Californians? And we are going to be highlighting some specific tribes in this lecture. Okay, so what you see here is a list of the key terms for the lecture. So for every lecture in my course, I have a list of key terms. These are terms that are going to be on tests, on quizzes. These are things that I want you to know about. So you should understand and know what each of these key terms are. So in other words, you should know the definition of all of them, but you also want to understand why the key term is important in the broader, bigger context of California history. So writing down the key terms, and then during the lecture really paying attention to those specific key terms is going to be really important for your success in this class. Also, on the study guide for the midterm exam and the final exam, there will be listed out the key terms that will be on the test. So they will be replicas of the key terms that we have here in lecture. So again, it all kind of ties together. A lot of these key terms you will also find in your textbook. You will find them in the index of your textbook in some cases. And again, this is just another way to kind of help guide your studying when you're talking about such a broad topic as history. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So just a little background information here. The coast of Alta California, which is the northern part of the California, which was distinguished from Baja California, will first be seen by Spaniards in 1542 with the Cabrillo expedition. And we are going to talk in greater detail about that when we talk about Spanish California and we talk about early exploration by the Spanish. At the time that the first Europeans spotted the shores of California, there was an estimated about 300,000 native people living there. Now, that number has been contested because we're not sure. We know that that is at least as many people as was there. It could have been much, much more. In fact, California was the most densely populated area in North America of native people outside of central Mexico. So we know it was very populous. We know that, for example, on Cabrillo's expedition, he documents in his journal that they can see native villages along the coast, that they see fires from native villages all up and down the coast, and that it appeared to be very densely populated. So we do know that there were quite a few people. And again, 300,000 is a conservative number. Some people have said there may have been more, like 500,000 or perhaps even a million Native people living throughout the state before first contact. Since Baja California was the first part of California that was sighted by the Spanish, by Hernan Cortez in early 1535, it really sparked the imagination of the Spanish, because it appeared to them from the Gulf of California like a gigantic island. And there had been an island that had been described in a very popular novel during that time period in Spain as being west of the Indies. Island was inhabited by these Amazon women, and these Amazon women were headed up by Queen Calafia. And so in this 16th century novel by Garcia Ordonez, The Adventures of Esplandian, this island was described as being very much near the gates of a terrestrial paradise. And again, it was inhabited by these Amazonian women who had, it seemed, unlimited access to gold, that gold was everywhere, and they wore these magnificent gold jewelry. And they were fierce, and they were to be feared, especially by men. So even from the very beginning, California kind of sparked the imaginations of people as being a land that's unique, almost mythical, and almost like a paradise. Of course, they were incorrect in assuming that California was an island. But to them, from their perspective, it makes a lot of sense why they thought that, because Baja California as a peninsula does stick way down out there, and it seems as if it could potentially be an island. So at that particular time, back when Cortez first spots this island, what he thinks is an island, Alta California had yet to be explored. So he is responsible for naming the area California, and again after this mythical queen in this very popular 16th century novel by Garcia Ordonez. California is one of those places that when people talk about it, it really depends upon where you are, right? It is a very diverse geographic region. Part of this has to do with our geology, the history of the state being along the Pacific Rim, and the various plate tectonic activities that have happened throughout our state, creating the mountains in our state. And then also just the fact that there are all of these different microclimates throughout the state, so that you could go to a place in the state that's very, very hot, like the desert, for example, and then just drive a few hours and be in a very cool forest, or maybe go to the coast and go into a coastal redwood forest. And then if you go up into the sort of northeastern corner of the state, you will get, these big lava fields, right? So up here in the northeastern corner of the state, there's all of this volcanic activity up here near Mount Lassen. And then, of course, the Sierra Nevadas with beautiful Yosemite Valley, which Yosemite Valley, of course, was carved by these glaciers. And in fact, glaciers still exist up there in the Sierra Nevada. And then, you have along the Sierra Nevada range, Mount Whitney, right? And Mount Whitney is the tallest mountain in the lower 48 states in the United States. And so at 14,000 plus feet, Mount Whitney is a magnificent mountain on the landscape of California, and then you just go, over here. So here's Mount Whitney, and then you just go a little further east, and you've got Death Valley, which is the lowest point in North America at 282 feet below sea level. You've got this remarkable coastline, right? 840 miles of coastline, which include Channel Islands and also the Farallon Islands up here off of the San Francisco Bay. You've got this magnificent desert down here in the Mojave Desert, and the Colorado River, which forms the border of the state between California and Arizona. So it's a very diverse geographic state, and because of that, we have a bunch of areas of our state that are considered ecological hotspots. And that is basically these areas of the world where only certain endemic species live. In other words, there are only places in California where certain species live, only here in California, which makes our environment really important to maintain the integrity of the environment of California in order to continue to ensure the survival of those species. So if you click on this link, it will take you to a pretty short video. It's only about 3 minutes long, but it's going to talk about the importance of California as an ecological hotspot. So we're now going to take kind of a tour of California, kind of the best of, if you will, of the state. So this is a scene from Highway 1 outside of Big Sur, California. California's coast, especially the central coast of California between like Santa Barbara and San Francisco, is considered one of the most beautiful, spectacular landscapes on the planet. And people come from all over the world to drive this Highway 1 up and down the coast of California. And it is really spectacular, and I highly recommend doing it sometime if you ever get the chance to do it. Here you have a photograph of the summit of Mount Whitney, and again, the tallest mountain in the contiguous United States at 14,494 feet. You can actually climb to the top of it. There's a trail. It's actually along the Pacific Coast Trail. And it just gives you really remarkable views, not only of the rest of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, but also the eastern part of California, which is kind of one of those parts of California that's lesser known, but it is very magnificent in its beauty. These beautiful plains, but also really dramatic mountains that jut up out of the landscape like Mount Whitney. And then here you have Badwater, California, which is elevation minus 282 feet. This is in Death Valley, and this is the lowest point in North America. So again, just emphasizing the extremes of California, where you've got, the highest point and then the lowest point, two totally different climates, of course, in these areas. Some of them even generating their own weather systems like Mount Whitney. And it's just it really does tell you a lot about how California is so diverse, not just in its people, which we're going to be talking about in a minute, but also in its landscapes. So here we have, of course, some more beautiful California landscapes. Up here we've got, of course, the very famous Yosemite Valley, where you've just got this magnificent granite valley that was carved from glacial activity that started to recede about 10,000 years ago, but left this just beautiful, almost God-like, like structure. I mean, some people have called it nature's cathedral, and it really is quite remarkable to visit, even though it does get very busy at the park certain times of year, but this is just you have to do it. I mean, if you've lived in California for any time, you've got to go see Yosemite Valley. And then here we have, of course, the giant redwoods, which again, similar to Yosemite, pictures don't really do it justice. They're so big, and they are one of the largest living things on the entire planet are these redwood trees, and some of them are 1,000+ years old, the old growth ones. And again, this is a part of California's landscape that is found nowhere else in the world except for a small section of China. So our redwood trees, both the coastal redwood trees and the giant sequoias, which are up in the Sierra Nevadas, are very, very unique to California. And again, bringing visitors from all over the world just to see the trees. And then finally, of course, I needed to give a shout out to our beautiful desert landscapes. And here we have, of course, the native fan palm, one of the only places in the Americas where palm trees grow as part of the native vegetation is in California in these desert oases. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about California's tribal communities. And if you'll notice here on the right, I've put up a map of the various tribal territories prior to European contact. So one of the things that you'll notice, of course, is how many there are. There was a ton of different tribes, lots of different languages. In fact, 100 different languages spoken throughout California prior to contact. These languages have been traced back to 6 linguistic origins, which is really quite remarkable. What that tells us is that people were coming from all over the Americas to California. So it's kind of interesting that California is now the most populous state in the nation, but also has often been a destination of people from other places. And that appears to have been true even back then, even in pre-contact times. People came to California from other places and settled here. So there are some staple foods coming from California. Probably the most important of the staple foods of the California tribes would be the acorns. And the acorns from the oak trees would be processed on a regular basis into a mush or a flour that would then be used as, like I said, a staple food. And a staple food is a food that can basically provide sustenance year-round. Acorns, of course, could be dried and harvested and then stored and then enjoyed, year-round. Acorns also contain very poisonous tannins, so they do have to be processed. They can't just be, harvested and then, ground up and eaten. They have to actually be soaked, and the tannins have to be removed from them before they can be consumed safely by humans. Also, hunting was big, and not just big game, but also small game throughout the state. Animals were very abundant. Even in desert areas, you've got the jackrabbit, for example. And then, of course, fishing. If you lived along the coast or along the rivers of California, which used to flow very freely and have lots of things like salmon in them, or a lake, you could have access to fish. So it depended upon your location. It depended upon where you lived, of course, how you ate. But there was also trading networks, and these trading networks would provide food for people even if they didn't have access for it. So acorns were one of those things, and the acorn meal was one of those things that could be traded throughout the state even if you didn't have access to the acorns directly. As I mentioned already, the population of Native people is estimated to be at least 300,000 before contact. We do know that the majority of tribes throughout California were semi-nomadic, and that just basically means that they moved around seasonally. So they would move from like a winter home to a summer home and then back to the winter home. And that seems to be the way that most of the tribes operated. There are some notable exceptions to that. One of them was the Chumash tribe, who really sort of stayed put right there along the coast, which is understandable because they had an abundance of resources available to them, and they didn't really have to move around based on weather, which of course is very temperate along the coast of California. They did have a very strong sense of management of natural resources. We know through their various tribal stories and that have been passed down in oral histories that one of the most important things for California Indians was the management of their resources, and particularly their plant resources. They understood things like that the state was very vulnerable to drought and to wildfire. So they would do things like controlled burns, where they were managing the landscape so that they could burn an area, clear out the underbrush and the vegetation and the dry vegetation that could potentially start a wildfire in the case of a lightning strike or something. And then that ash from that fire would then rejuvenate the soil and allow for that soil to rejuvenate and for new plant growth to happen. And they understood that, so they did things like controlled burns. They also did things like teaching up-and-coming generations how to harvest and hunt in a sustainable way. So if you were a young Native American girl, because typically it was the girls that did the harvesting of the plants, you would be taught that, in order for that plant to continue to survive, you can't take the entire plant. You always make sure that you leave an area of the plant that can grow seeds so that those seeds could then fall to the soil and then, rejuvenate new plant life. So things like that, sustaining natural resources, using natural resources in a smart way, and then also controlling the environment in order to protect, villages and things like that from wildfires. One of the interesting things is, before the first European to arrive in the Yosemite Valley in 1850s, the Sierra Miwok, which are the natives that lived up here in the Yosemite Valley, what they did on a regular basis is they did a controlled burn of the entire valley floor, and that kept that area from, having any kind of wildfire. So if you look at older photographs of the Yosemite Valley from like the 1860s or whatever, you'll notice that the valley itself is much less forested than it is today, because the natives would consistently do these controlled burns. And not every year, but it was just enough of a regular basis to keep all of the dry weeds and things like that out of the valley to protect their villages. Okay, so now we're going to go through several different tribal groups in California. Of course, from the map that there are a lot, so it's impossible to do, all of them. So I'm going to focus on mostly Southern California tribes. We'll also talk a little bit about a Central Coast tribe as well. So the Chumash. The Chumash are very notable for a lot of reasons. One is, as I already mentioned, is that they had permanent villages, and these villages were very large. They were typically ruled by, one tribal chief and then a tribal group that would, like a council that would basically advise the chief. And they really made an impression upon the Spanish because the Spanish had early contact with them along the coast. And in fact, the Spanish saw them working wood. That's where the town name Carpinteria comes from. So Santa Barbara, right south of Santa Barbara, there's this little town called Carpinteria. And, it's basically like woodworking shop in Spanish. And the reason why it's called that is because when the Spanish sailed past there, they noticed that the Chumash would be out on the beaches and they were working wood, and they were well known for their woodwork. Not only did they make these wooden canoes that could be sailed out, or paddled out, I should say, to the Channel Islands, they also did really beautiful woodwork, making wooden bowls and things like that. And these were all commodities that they could trade with other tribes. They're also noticed because notable because of how large they were. They're very large. I'm going to show you a map in a minute of their territory, but basically you're talking San Luis Obispo down to Malibu, all the way out to the Channel Islands, and then all the way inland into the San Joaquin Valley, which we also call the Central Valley. As I mentioned, their villages were very large. They have a well-defined caste system, so we do know that they had a very sort of tribal hierarchy, with the tribal elders and the tribal chief being at the top. We do know that they had a patrilineal system, which is not true for all Native people. A lot of Native tribes would have a matriarchal system, or sometimes they would also have female chiefs. That doesn't appear to be the case in the Chumash, but that doesn't mean that the women didn't have a certain element of power. Or perhaps some women might have served on the tribal council to advise the chief. As I mentioned, woodworking was huge with the Chumash, and again, notable and noticed right away by the Spanish. Basket making as well, but they were more known for their woodworking. Because they had access to so many resources, they had connections with very large trading networks. So not only would they trade their woodworking material and dried fish and other things that they could harvest from the sea, like shells, but they would also be able to trade their tar. So along the coast, this central coast area, along Santa Barbara and Carpinteria and these areas, there's this natural tar that comes up from the ground. So much so that if you actually visit the beaches there and you walk down the beach occasionally, depending upon the day or whatever, you might get some of this tar like stuck between your toes, as you're walking down the beach. And it's sort of a gooey, it's like a gooey, it's a tar substance. It's from all of the oil and things that are underneath the ground there. And this tar, it turns out, is really good for, is basically an adhesive, holding things together, sealing things. They used it to help seal their boats. And they would also use it for trade because, of course, that was a unique substance that they had that they could share with other tribes. So as I mentioned, the Spanish were really quite impressed with the Chumash, especially their woodworking techniques, and also the fact that they lived in these large permanent villages. They describe them as gentle, which doesn't really surprise me because the Spanish had a tendency to just patronize California Indians generally. So basically, they would go along and they would, when they were describing them, they would, describe them in sort of these very diminutive terms. And if they, the other thing is that the Chumash did make contact with them and did engage in trading with them. So they were one of the tribes that didn't run initially from the Spanish. So that could be another reason why they describe them as gentle, quote unquote. Okay, so if we look here at the map, we can see the Chumash territory, and again, it is very extensive, going all the way from the coastal regions of California and Santa Barbara to the Channel Islands, all the way out here into the San Joaquin and Central Valley. So very, very large territory for the Chumash. So this is a link about 4 minutes long. This is a link to a woman telling a Chumash origin story, and she's telling the story of the Rainbow Bridge, talking about how people from the Channel Islands connected to their mainland neighbors. It's just a really interesting story. This is a tribal elder from the Chumash tribe, and so she's sharing it. And one of the things, if you do link onto it and listen to it, which I recommend, I want you to think about the different ways in which Native people understood the world around them, how they described the world and how they described their history. Because it is so distinct and different from the ways in which Europeans understood the world around them, that it really kind of lays the foundation for a lot of the cultural misunderstandings that we see between Europeans and Native people. Okay, another thing that the Chumash were well known for were their pictographs and petroglyphs. And you can see an example of one of them right here on this slide. One of the interesting things about the Chumash pictographs in particular, which are the ones that are done with paint, is that they use a lot of geometric designs and also just kind of abstract designs. So that makes them unique. A lot of other tribes with their pictographs and petroglyphs would, use human forms a lot or animal forms, and the Chumash do that too. But they're kind of unique in that they have a lot of these geometric designs. So these caves are found in more of the inland regions of the Chumash territory. They're considered very sacred sites by the Chumash, and they're very difficult to get to. Some of them have actually been protected and kind of walled off so that people don't have access to them and people can't vandalize them. But I've got a video later on in the lecture that will give you access to a little tour of one of these caves. Okay, so here's an artist rendering of a Chumash village. You'll notice there that they're, living in these huts that are essentially made from tree and grass material. You'll notice that they have some racks here for drying fish, and then, of course, very notably is the canoes here, which they are very well known for, and again, one of the reasons why the Spanish really highly admired them was for their woodworking abilities. Okay, so this is a link to a video. Now, heads up about this video. This video is really long and very homemade. So you don't have to watch it, or if you do watch it, feel free to fast forward it and, kind of just get to the part where, he's going into the cave and kind of giving you a tour of the pictographs and the petroglyphs. So the difference between pictographs and pictographs are done with the paint, and the petroglyphs are done with like a carving into the actual rock. So in the example that you're going to see here, this guy's going to hike into one of these Chumash sites, and they have both pictographs and petroglyphs there. So feel free to click on that and check that out if you'd like. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talk about the Cahuilla. The Cahuilla, of course, are very important to us here living in the Coachella Valley. They are a local tribe. This is their land. And I will show you a map of their territory in a minute, but they also have quite a large territory. From the San Bernardino Mountains south to the Chocolate Mountains and Borrego Springs, and that includes the Coachella Valley and the Imperial Valley. The Cahuilla are interesting in that they share a linguistic origin with the Aztecs, which suggests that at some point bands of Aztecs actually broke away from central Mexico and migrated up to the current location of the Cahuilla territory. They were sustained by ancient Lake Cahuilla, which we believe geologists and others believe dried up sometime in the 1600s. So it would have been right around the time of contact, but it wouldn't have been the time of contact for the Cahuilla. The Cahuilla don't have contact until later, and the Cahuilla remained pretty isolated from the rest of from the contact with Europeans because of their isolation in these inland regions. But ancient Lake Cahuilla was the result of the Colorado River shifting course and dumping water into, or diverting water into, the Salton Sea Basin, which essentially, so the Colorado River essentially fed Lake Cahuilla for a very long time. And we're going to talk more about the Salton Sea later on in our course when we talk about the creation of the modern Salton Sea. But during the time that the Cahuilla were really surviving and thriving in this area, this lake provided a much needed source of water, but also fish and other things. So we think right around the 1500s, 1600s, this lake dried up, so that by the time you get contact with the Spanish, the lake has already been dry. The first documented contact with Europeans was 1774. That's when Juan Bautista de Anza took an overland expedition from Mexico to Monterey and passed through the Coachella Valley, and noted in his journal the Cahuilla Indians that he met along the way. Also noted in his journal the hot springs, and that's how the Cahuilla tribe over towards Palm Springs got the name Agua Caliente. So here you see a map of the range of the Cahuilla Indians. And again, this is a kind of a generic term. The term Cahuilla is a generic term that describes a bunch of different bands of Native people living in this region. So one of the things that the Cahuilla had, and all of the tribes around California had something, that they could share with other tribes, that they could trade with other tribes. And for the Cahuilla, it was often the Jimson weed, and that's kind of a colloquial term for this plant that you see here. And I'm sure if you've been out on some desert walks or something like that, you may have seen this plant. It often grows on the side of the highway, I've noticed. But basically, this Jimson weed was the basis for a psychedelic narcotic drink that the Cahuilla knew the recipe for and would make for certain rituals that they had throughout the year. And it was highly desired by other tribes, so they were able to use that as a trading commodity. Of course, the desert oases, like the Indian canyons, will really provide kind of the basis of the way in which the Cahuillas could endure and thrive and live in the harsh desert environment. Of course, you have the fresh water that's available in the canyons. You also have the shelter of the fan palms, and the fan palms created the basis of their shelters and their housing that they would build, and also the mats that they would sleep on. And also the beautiful baskets that they would weave. And the Cahuilla were known for their basket techniques and their basket making skills. So here you have some images of Cahuilla from the early 20th century. As you can see in this one photograph here, we're talking about 1924. So the Cahuilla were still very much living in very sort of traditional ways all the way into the 20th century. And again, this is kind of a function of the fact that they were relatively isolated and there wasn't a whole lot of contact with Europeans. Of course, that begins to change as we get into the 20th century and further, and of course, with the coming of the railroad in the late 19th century, that change will be accelerated. But you can really get a sense of the traditional lifestyles that endured. You'll also get a smallpox outbreak that is going to come through the valley. That's going to happen in the 1860s, and that's going to be pretty devastating for a lot of the Cahuilla, and huge amounts of their tribal members are going to die as a result of that smallpox outbreak. So here you have some examples of the Cahuilla and their basket weaving skills. Again, you can just see the really intricate designs, the fact that they are so tightly woven. Keep in mind that these were not just pieces of beautiful artwork, but they also had a lot of utilitarian purposes. You know, if you wanted to boil water, you had to be able to have a basket that was watertight. And so, let me give you an example with the acorns. So the acorns, as I mentioned, they had to be, the tannins had to be leached from the acorns. And so the way that they would do this is because they don't have traditional cooking pots, they would be able to heat up a water, but the way that they heated the water and boiled the water was they put regular water into one of these baskets, and then they would take stones from a fire and heat them until they were super, super, super red hot, basically. And then you took that stone from the fire and put it into the basket, and that would cause the water to boil. And then you could put the acorns in there, and then those tannins from the acorns would be leached out. So that's an example of how hardy these baskets had to be. I mean, not only did they have to, be able to hold water and be watertight, but also they had to be able to endure the intense heat of boiling water. So beautiful pieces of art, but also very utilitarian in nature. Okay, so this is a link that I really recommend clicking on. It is a kind of a long one. I think it's about 15 minutes long. But what you're going to hear here is a tribal elder, Moriano Potencio, who is going to be speaking for the Cahuilla people. It's actually a C-SPAN interview, and he's going to be just talking about Cahuilla history kind of generally. And then he's going to, and also his understanding of Cahuilla history through the oral histories that he's heard. And then also he's going to talk about the Cahuilla in present day and how the Cahuilla have really sort of learned to survive and adapt to the various changes that have taken place in their tribal community over the past several centuries. So I recommend clicking on this. There is nothing better than hearing about Native history from people who grew up in Native communities and who have heard these oral histories get passed down through the generations. Okay, the final tribe that we are going to talk about today are the Costanoans, and I'm using them as kind of a comparison because comparatively they were probably considered by the Spanish initially as a lot more primitive than some of these Southern California tribes, and definitely more primitive than the Chumash tribes. They lived in very sort of small, I would call it more semi-permanent villages. They certainly did do these semi-nomadic, things where they would have winter homes and southern homes. The Costanoans were along the coast of Central California from Monterey to the Bay Area. Um, there were 8 different language groups within the Costanoan tribal group. So that just gives you a sense of how diverse these tribes were. And they all had their territories, and it's believed that their population at contact was somewhere around 10,000. And they were some of the first to have contact because the second mission, of course, was built in Carmel on the Monterey Peninsula. We're going to talk more about that, of course, when we talk about the missions. The territorial boundaries of these tribes would cause frequent warfare between them, and mostly over hunting rights and the ability to hunt in certain areas and have access to certain resources. This particular region is very rich in not just animals and plant life, but you also have acorns and lots of different oak forests in this area. The grizzly bears were relatively abundant in this region, especially in the mountain areas, and so they were considered very sacred by the Costanoan people. And They were even sometimes kept by the tribes as, I guess, pets slash, you know, objects of worship. And it was considered, you were considered a very powerful shaman if, you know, you wore the bear skins. So grizzly bears were very sacred to the Costanoans. And this is an important point because when the Europeans did come and start to settle in the region, of course, one of the things that they begin to do almost immediately was to kill the grizzly bears because they were seen as such a threat. And, you know, I think immediately when the Costanoan people saw this happening, they recognized that the people that they were dealing with were not people that they understood. And so it immediately caused, I think, an alarm bell to go off in their minds. They had very large families and sort of informal marriage partnerships. And again, this was another thing that really struck a lot of the European observers was that women would sometimes have babies with multiple men, and that was not considered unusual or odd. The lineage was through the mother. But when the Europeans observed this, of course, they saw this as either the women were being promiscuous, or on the other hand, that the men weren't being strong enough in controlling their women. And so they sort of saw the Native American men as being weak. And so, again, this is sort of the basis for a lot of this cultural misunderstanding that we are going to see, particularly with California Indian people. They really were perceived as being especially primitive compared to other native groups. And we're going to talk a little bit more in my summary. I'll talk a little bit more as to why that is. Okay, so here we see the Costanoan tribal boundaries, basically from down here in the Monterey area. This is the Monterey Bay, excuse me, up to the San Francisco Bay Area, the south side of the San Francisco Bay Area. So this whole region right here, and again, pretty big, but there were a lot of different bands within that territory. So they lived in very mild climates, very moderate temperatures, not too hot, not too cold. They had an incredibly abundant food supply, as you can see from this artist rendering of native people, probably the Ohlone, again, a Costanoan band, down by the San Francisco Bay. And you just notice, you know, well, you notice first off their structures, but then you notice all of the birds in the air. And, you know, the access to these bay estuaries would have given them incredible access to fish and all kinds of animals, because people, you know, animals would come down to the shores of the bay. And, you know, so you could have, you know, deer, you could have bear, you could have, of course, rabbits, squirrels, just all kinds of animals, and then tons of plant life as well. So just a very abundant, rich environment to draw from and to live off of. This is an Ohlone reed boat. So these reeds would have been harvested down in these estuaries and these marshlands that exist in the central, along the San Francisco Bay, but also on the central coast. These reeds then would be tied very tightly into these boats, which would be used just to kind of tootle around the bays and the estuaries and the wetlands. Obviously, these are not seaworthy boats, but this then allowed for the Ohlone and other Costanoans to go into the waterways and to fish using nets and other things. Okay, so a few things just to summarize this particular section of the course of Native people, which we're going to continue to talk about for the next few lectures, but I want to just summarize some of the basic things here. Until the California Gold Rush, which of course we will talk about extensively when we get to that point in history, in California history, which won't be until week 4. But until then, you had a native population in California that vastly outnumbered people of European origin. And this was true even despite the fact that by the time the Spanish had their way with the native population and the mission system had existed, that the population of indigenous people in California basically dropped by 50%. So if we go back to our original, 300,000 native people, and then by the end of the Spanish and Mexican period, you've got 150,000. They still vastly outnumbered people of European origin. So it was, they had a major impact on the early settlements of California. Unfortunately, California Indians are some of the least understood of all North American tribes because they were described by the Spanish in such sort of, as I mentioned earlier, diminutive terms, very much seen like children, sometimes being described as stupid or ugly, and also not really seen as being very productive, right? One of the things that is a constant source of misunderstanding between Native people and Europeans is the ways in which Native people use the land, quote unquote. Europeans are constantly, if you look back in the sources, accusing indigenous people of not using the land properly. And one of the things that you have to realize, especially in the case of California Indians, is that California Indians didn't have agriculture. And one of the reasons for this is they didn't need it, right? So California Indians, one of the reasons why they didn't have these big sort of elaborate settlements and this agricultural systems and all of that is they had access to such abundant resources that there was no need for them to actually create those systems. Where if you compare them, for example, with the Pueblo people in the desert Southwest, where you have these really intensely dry, arid climates, you really need to have a permanent settlement that is going to be able to adapt to the environment and be able to utilize whatever a little bit of resources there are in terms of water and create water diversion systems, and then have agriculture that you grow to sustain your community. That was a necessity with the Pueblo people, but in California that was just simply not the case. And so California Indians were able to harvest what they needed from the land. They were able to utilize and maintain and manage their abundant natural resources. So again, that's one of those sources of cultural misunderstanding. And then finally, California Indians really contributed greatly, in fact, so much that we don't even probably know or may never know because it was never acknowledged. But we do know that the California Indians, not only did they co-build and for the most part build the early settlements of Spanish California, but they also contributed to the survival of the Spanish by sharing with them information about local resources and different ways to survive off of the land and cultivate, or not necessarily cultivate, but harvest from the land the things that were necessary to survive and also to provide medicine. Keep in mind that California Native women were keepers of generations of knowledge of California native plants and how to utilize those to cure or help various medical conditions. So California Indians are going to contribute not only to the construction of early California, but also to the survival of those European communities that are going to come. And so our next lecture is really going to get into talking about the arrival of the Spanish, the impact that that has on Native people. And as I mentioned already, really these first several lectures that we are going to cover in this class are going to be specifically focused on the experiences of Native people, and then we will shift and talk more about the European perspective and then, of course, eventually the transition to the American period. All right, well, if you have any questions about today's lecture, please let me know. Send me an email or come and see me on Zoom. All right, have a good one, guys. Take care.